My guest today represents Washington's 9th Congressional District and serves as the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee. Congressman Adam Smith, welcome back to Pod Save America.
Well, that's great. Great to be on. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, too. Thank you for doing this. So I want to talk with you this week because on Tuesday, you released a statement calling on the Israeli government to implement a ceasefire in Gaza to massively increase the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza and to stop the expansion of settlements in the West Bank and settler violence in the West Bank. You said that if Israel does not take these steps, that it is, quote, time for the United States government to stop the sale of some offensive weapons systems to Israel as leverage. So my question is, what systems are you talking about, and what made you change your mind about blocking these weapons sales?
Sure. I'm not at the moment specific about the weapon systems. I would have supported both of the resolutions of disapproval in the Senate. It's more about using the leverage. I think obviously the focus would be on offensive weapon systems, but we just want to use that leverage to force a change in Israeli policy, to force a change in their calculation, because to date, Netanyahu has been resistant to any pressure. Of course, the Trump administration is putting no pressure, but it's just sort of done what they want. So we have to use that leverage. As I think you well know, we provide over 60% of the weapons that Israel uses. It is a legit leverage point. And what has changed is the facts on the ground have changed in a number of key areas. One, you can't legitimately say that you can accomplish something more militarily against Hamas. Mm-hmm. Hamas does need to be significantly weakened and taken out of the equation. I don't think we can eliminate them, but that's been done. And Israeli generals for a couple months now have said there is nothing more militarily to be accomplished in weakening Hamas. The only way to weaken Hamas, in my opinion, at this point, is to present a plausible alternative within the Palestinian people. So there's nothing militarily that can be achieved. That has changed. Second, Israel is not as vulnerable as they were even a few months ago because of what has happened with the weakening, certainly of Hamas, but also of Hezbollah. I mean, it wasn't that long ago when Hezbollah was lobbing rockets into northern Israel, and you had, I think it was 70,000 Israelis who were evacuated from those areas. Iran has been significantly weakened. Assad is gone, a key ally of Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. I was concerned before that weakening our sales of weapons to Israel made them vulnerable to all of those people and to their very existence. That no longer is plausibly the case given how weakened those organizations have been. And then, of course, given Israel's decision in March to cut off all humanitarian assistance for, I think it was almost 2.5 months, the humanitarian crisis is vastly worse than it was. So the facts have changed.
Yeah. So, as you know, there are a lot of Democrats who agree with you now, but sort of wish that the party had gotten to this place sooner. So I just want to push you on some of those areas of criticism. So, what would you say to a critic who read your statement and said, you know what, the United States should be cutting off these weapon sales to Israel because they're being used to slaughter innocent people in Gaza, especially kids. And we shouldn't need all this broader, regional security context. And that even if we did have that broader context, like Hamas has been routed for a while, as you noted, as has Hezbollah. Iran, it sort of seemed clear that they were a bit of a paper tiger even during the 12-day war. Doesn't this feel like, a decision you could have come to a few months ago at least?
Well, it hasn't been that long. A few months ago, arguably 2 or 3 months. But there's two things about it. One, I have put out statements a couple of months ago calling for these actions. So it's not the first time I've said that Israel should change these policies, particularly on the West Bank issues. That's been a long time. So several months ago, I reached this conclusion and stated so publicly. The only change in the statement is the restrict weapons. And I consider that to be a pretty strong step, given, again, Israel's threats and where they're at. And I had conversations with the Israeli ambassador several times with the Trump administration urging this, because I wanted this to be done in cooperation. But it's clear now that that's not going to happen. Now, could it have come a month ago? Sure. I think that's probably a fair criticism. 3, 6, 8 months ago, No, I do think that Israel was threatened at that point, and we saw that in the attack that Iran launched against them. The other thing that's really different about where I'm coming from a lot of the people who have been against supporting Israel for some time, is I do believe, A, that Israel should have the right to continue to exist as a country, which is not really the position of a majority of people on the other side of this debate. And I don't share that. And B, that Israel did face legitimate threats to that. There are some people that say, oh, don't give me that Israel has a right to exist thing. Israel can take care of itself. They're not under threat. But if the U.S. pulled out, as has been argued that they should a long time ago, heck, let's remember that Cori Bush's, ceasefire resolution came out within a week of October 7th and didn't say anything about the hostages. So if you did that, then Israel would have been vulnerable, going back to the 60% of weapons that come from the U.S., and they clearly face people who don't want them to exist as a country. I've always felt that this is part of the problem in getting to peace. I mean, if I go to Israel and say, you need to make these changes so there can be a legitimate Palestinian state, they can have sovereignty, self-determination, that's one thing. But if in fact what that is, well, I want to put the people who don't think that you should exist as a country in a better position to accomplish that objective, that is a much more difficult conversation with Israel and their supporters.
So there's a lot there. I just want to take on sort of slices of this because it is complicated. I mean, the other thing I think you hear from a lot of folks is, look, I hear you on all this context, but current U.S. law prohibits the selling or transfer of weapons to militaries that are in violation of international humanitarian law. Specifically, that would include laws that prohibit the withholding or blocking of humanitarian aid, which Israel has been doing since the very beginning of this conflict, including a few months ago, which led to this acute famine. For that reason alone, aren't these weapons sales illegal?
I think it is debatable because of the way Hamas is fighting. Okay. And it doesn't, and restricting humanitarian aid is one thing. Cutting it off is another. Certainly is a legit complaint from when, Israel made that decision. And Israel claimed, well, we're building up a different thing and all of that. But prior to that, it's not true that if you just say, if you're trying to restrict humanitarian assistance from getting to enemy combatants, which is what Israel claimed they were doing. It's not as cut and dried as that. You are not obligated to provide assistance to the people who are fighting against you under our law. Number one. Number two, Hamas very much does embed themselves within the civilian population and use that. I mean, they killed a number of top Hamas commanders, underneath a parking lot in a hospital. I mean, that happened. So that's what Israel was dealing with. Was a foe that was willing to violate those laws. And by the way, that too is a violation of the international laws of conflict and war, embedding yourself within a civilian population. Maybe people deny that Hamas was doing that. I mean, I've seen substantial evidence that they were in fact doing that, and that's what Israel had to deal with. And that is a very different conflict than fighting an enemy that tries to separate civilians from combatants.
But if you would, doesn't under the Geneva Convention, aren't occupying powers and parties to a conflict, aren't they required to provide humanitarian relief, including food, if civilians are not being adequately supplied?
Yeah, no, I said that.
Okay.
The civilians, absolutely. But Israel's argument always was they were restricting the aid getting into because Hamas was going to take over it, so they had different corridors. And it was only in March that they cut it all off. They had been letting aid in. Now, and I had long argued, I was in Rafah back in February of 2024 and met with the Red Crescent and a variety of other organizations and said that Israel needs to do more to let humanitarian assistance get in. I'm not disagreeing with that. But the idea that any efforts to restrict humanitarian assistance is an absolute 100% violation of the law is not 100% accurate.
So I hear you on the broader point you were making earlier that Israel's in a tough neighborhood. There are, without a doubt, organizations on their borders that part of their charter is they want Israel to no longer to exist. Hamas, Hezbollah, et cetera. But look, Hamas recently accepted a temporary ceasefire deal that was basically the same as one that Netanyahu had agreed to, I think, last month. Currently, the Israeli government is just ghosting that proposal. They're just refusing to respond to it. And when you sort of look at Israeli public opinion, Israeli media, like the hostages, their families want a deal. There's hundreds of military and intelligence experts who say that Hamas has been decimated and there's no military value to continuing this conflict, as you said earlier. And to me, it's a fact that is stated over and over again in the Israeli media that Netanyahu is prolonging this war for political purposes to keep his right-wing governing coalition together. And isn't that sort of knowledge a reason enough to stop supporting this war and to stop providing munitions?
100%.
Yeah.
That's why I took the position I took. And that's why, like I said 2 months ago, I took the position I took completely. I don't disagree with anything you said there.
Okay. So in your statement, you also mentioned you call on the Israeli government to stop the expansion of settlements in the West Bank. And I just wanted to dig into that issue for the audience who probably don't know why this is so important. First question, do you support efforts to have the United States unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state? And if not, are you a supporter of a two-state solution? Like, how are you thinking about the broader sort of like peace process at this point?
Yeah, first of all, to directly answer the question, I'm not in favor of I don't support the countries that have unilaterally recognized a Palestinian state, and it's not a step that I would have the U.S. take. Okay. Ultimately, I am a supporter of a two-state solution, but I think talking about a two-state solution at this point is pointless because that's a long way off in the future. What we should be talking about is greater autonomy and prosperity for the Palestinian people. Eventually we want them to have greater control of their own situation. But, that's just kind of something to say. What we really need to do is we need to rush economic aid. We need to help them develop an economy. We need to help them develop their government. This is stuff that was going on back in 2005. The only time in my lifetime that I have been optimistic about what was going to happen there was when I visited Ramallah in the region back in 2005. And the U.S. was participating in a thing with Israel whereby we were developing the security forces of the Palestinian. We were developing their government. And we were helping them develop and grow their economy. And you could see there were cranes in Ramallah. Things were being built. Things were going forward. And then, of course, Netanyahu got into power and torpedoed all of that. Those are the steps that we need to take. Now, the reason I'm not willing to do a unilateral recognition, and I know Ro Khanna has introduced something. I read the outline of it today. And one of the things he says in there is we need a Palestinian state with security guarantees for Israel and with Hamas out of the picture. And I agree, all those things. But if we unilaterally just say there's a Palestinian state without those things that it said in the letter we needed to get, well, that's contradictory. But we need to move in that direction without question. And again, whether or not it's a formal state, the key thing in the short term is greater autonomy, self-governance, the ability to run your economy, and frankly, hope in an economic future. And that is the way right now, in my opinion, for Israel to deal with Hamas. Support an alternative.
Yeah.
Work with the Arab states that have, and I've met with King Abdullah, I've met with MBS, I've met with UAE, I've met with the Egyptian leadership. They don't exactly have their stuff together as much as the others do, but they are all anxious to work with, and they have a variety of different Palestinians inside and outside of the Palestinian Authority, by the way, who they think are reasonable partners to work with, who they've been trying to get the Israeli government to let them work with for quite some time. That is how you stop Hamas at this point, not with more bombs, but with an alternative. And so that's what I support. Now, the West Bank stuff is even more problematic because that makes it more difficult to create a legitimate Palestinian state as Israel both, gobbles up more of that territory and then creates a violent environment for the Palestinians living in that neighborhood just in general.
You're getting at the point that I wanted to talk about, which is, you're starting to see more and more experts on the Middle East peace process. There's a great piece by Rob Malley in the New Yorker this week where they're sort of sounding the alarm, and they're saying basically they think that either the hope of a two-state solution is either dead or nearly dead. And that's in part because, as you said, the West Bank has already been carved up by all these settlements, and what's left for Palestinians is by no means a contiguous landmass or area that you would consider a state in any respect. But then last week, the Israeli government approved the settlement project in an area in the West Bank called E1. And for listeners, like the E1 settlements, if built, would sever the West Bank from East Jerusalem, the northern West Bank from the southern West Bank. And to be clear, like, this is by design. Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister of Israel, called E1 settlement, quote, a nail in the coffin for the creation of a Palestinian state. So my question is, like, I worry that when you hear people default to saying, well, I'm for a two-state solution, that when you understand the facts on the ground, and you understand the sort of reality of the makeup of the Netanyahu government and their support for the settler movement, it almost seems like a way of being for something that we all know is just completely unrealistic, if not foreclosed at this point.
Well, that's why I emphasize that I'm not talking primarily about a two-state solution at this point. I am talking about greater economy, greater hope, greater economic opportunity for the Palestinian people. And that needs to be the focus. I mean, look, the whole situation has backed us into a corner. Now, something that your listeners should understand that I don't think they often hear. I've met with the Israeli ambassador several times, had many conversations with him. So the history, go all the way back to the history of the 1930s when they were both the Jews and the Palestinians were trying to drive the British out. And then the decision was made on the Palestinian side, okay, Jews, you can stay, but you're not going to run anything. There's no state. And that set off a civil war in 1936 that really hasn't stopped going forward. And then Oslo, of course, in 93 really put us on the path to a two-state solution. But then when the negotiations in 2000, the Camp David negotiations under Clinton fell apart, when the second intifada started and targeted civilian infrastructure, school buses, shopping malls, everything so aggressively, that pushed a lot of Israelis to saying, screw this, it's us or them.
Yep.
All right. And then October 7th ramped that up even further.
Yeah.
Now, and look, I understand if you're a very strong pro-Israel person. And I have many of those in my district. I have an interesting district. It's both solidly Democratic, so it has a lot of pro-Palestinian people, and also has the most synagogues. The synagogues in this area are all in my district, either in southeast Seattle or in Mercer Island. And there's very passionate feelings about that. And I can certainly understand an Israeli person saying, don't tell me that we have to do all this stuff for the Palestinians. Eventually, they're coming for us. I get that. I don't support it. I know that in doing what I'm proposing here, there is risk for the Israeli people. I understand that. But that risk, to my mind, is well worth taking if it gives some type of future for the Palestinian people. And I'm just not going to support a policy that says, nope, we're just fighting it out. And whoever wins, the other side gets kicked out. That's not something that I'm going to support. But I can tell you that's a huge battle with the Israeli people. And when, as I said, the majority of people who have been in the cut off Israel camp for a long time, even before October 7th, are of the camp that no, should be a one-state solution, and that state should not be Israel. That makes peace tougher because Israel, they're not going to agree to that.
Yeah, I hear you. And look, I mean, I think this is just so challenging, right? Because everyone is so used to defaulting to, well, we need a two-state solution. We need a negotiated agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And that feels like the hopeful thing to talk about. But I do worry. I wonder if sometimes just letting Netanyahu enter into peace talks that he knows will go nowhere allows him to just buy time and continue settlement construction and consider this de facto annexation that we're seeing happening in the West Bank that is just going to foreclose any hope of a Palestinian state.
Yeah, no, and I don't disagree with that. And that's where we got to leverage. Now, it was complicated. It was complicated when Hamas did what they did.
Yes, of course.
And said, we'll keep doing it. And openly asked for Hezbollah and Iran and the Houthis and everybody else to join in that conflict. That gave Israel a plausible, hey, we're just fighting for our survival thing. Now, long before that, I had called for a stop in the West Bank settlements and, for sanctions against all of that. Yeah, no, there's no easy solution to this. It is an ugly, ugly problem. And I'm not going to presume that there is. And certainly, and we've talked about this in some of the broader contexts of what it does to the Democratic Party coalition.
Yeah.
Because it gets after some of the deeper divides that are in there, and picks at those wounds and makes it very difficult for us to deal with the very existential threat. You've noticed the fascist takeover of the country that's going on right now, I assume. And I know you've talked about it.
Yes.
And that's what it is. I mean, it is as bad as anyone thinks it is. It's worse. I mean, Trump is shredding the Constitution as we speak. And I agree with Gavin Newsom. If he can figure out a way not to have an election in 2028, he'll do it. So yeah, we could walk down that road, but look, we got to figure out how to make this coalition work better.
I'm with you, and I'm talking to you from once military occupied Los Angeles, so we feel the anxiety acutely here. But I really did appreciate the chance to talk to you about the statement you put out about Gaza, because I like you worry that it is tearing apart the Democratic Party. I see elected officials, having been working on this stuff for a long time, I see elected officials moving to a more progressive place on policy faster than I ever could have imagined possible. But also, I feel like there's a recognition that that is still behind where a lot of the Democratic Party base is. And so I think, the only thing we can do here is kind of thrash these things out in public, as we all just read about the DNC doing, and you and I are trying to do here. So that's sort of where I'm getting at on these questions. And one thing that we've talked about on this show is AIPAC, and whether the Democratic Party should accept money or support from AIPAC. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I think that we should, but it depends. They may not give it if you take a certain position. Look, I've always, and I realize I'm about to say something that very few people listening on this show are going to agree with at all. But I've never liked the idea of saying that if you accept a legal contribution, that makes you corrupt. We've seen that all over the place. Oh, you can't take money of these people off it. And my argument is this just paves the way for Donald Trump. Donald Trump comes along. He's ripping off, forget campaign contributions. The dude's putting billions of dollars in his own pocket. And I've got so many people say, well, they're all corrupt. If you take a legal campaign contribution from an entity, to attack somebody for doing that is absurd to my mind, because it basically undermines representative democracy. That's how it works, all right? Second, I have always been of the opinion, under no circumstances am I going to take an action or a vote based on the money that's coming to me. So if I run around and say, I'm not going to take money from them, what I basically say to you is, I'm so weak, I'm so credited, this person gives me $5,000, I just know I'll do the wrong thing. And I've never felt that way.
No.
I've had a lot of donors walk away from me. I strongly suspect that I will not be getting as much money from AIPAC this cycle as I have in the past. And I don't care. All right. It's come and gone with AIPAC. I supported the JCPOA, adamantly opposed Trump shredding it. I supported UNRWA continuing being funded in 2018. And so it's gone up and down. The irony, the main reason I got money from AIPAC last cycle is because 6 weeks after October 7th, when I didn't support Cori Bush's ceasefire, my home was vandalized. And I've had protesters show up a couple of times since then. And it became a thing. The Israeli ambassador called me. A whole bunch of people called me and said, this is terrible. This is the same time that people were vandalizing synagogues and doing all manner of different other things. And so it bothered me. It didn't change my position on anything. So I don't think Democrats should advertise and say, we're not going to take money from this group or that group. Vote. Take your positions. And if this group thinks that's something they like, it's a democracy. They can donate. They cannot donate. I don't buy the idea that you are corrupt if you take a campaign contribution from somebody. If you can show me where I haven't taken a position or done something that's completely wrong, okay, fine. But I'm not buying the idea that you're corrupt based on the money you raise.
So look, a few things. First of all, no one should have their home vandalized for any reason, for any vote, for anything. And I'm sorry that happened to you. I didn't know that. That's fucked up and terrible. Second, I don't think accepting money from a group makes people corrupt, but I do think we get judged by our associations, and we should be clear-eyed about kind of the goals of the groups that we associate with. And my argument for why Democrats should not take money from AIPAC would be that, AIPAC essentially demands boundless support for Netanyahu's policies, including the arms sales that you oppose. It seems clear to me that they want Trump to be president. They want Republicans to be in charge. The AIPAC endorsed, I think, like 100 some odd election deniers and insurrectionists. So it doesn't seem like they give two shits about our democracy. And then in recent elections, AIPAC keeps messing around in Democratic primary campaigns through DMFI and other groups and running all these attack ads against progressive Democrats based on issues that have nothing to do with Israel. So it just seems like AIPAC is working in opposition to a lot of the things we care about as a party.
Yeah, what I would say, that's a reason not to vote with them. That's not a reason not to take their money. Okay. I mean, yeah, like I said, if I'm going on the radio and saying, oh, this is AIPAC's position, therefore it must be my position. Absolutely. That's wrong. That's terrible. Yeah. But I will tell you also, AIPAC is not a monolithic entity. I have spoken to AIPAC groups in my own state, in New York, in a variety of other places. I've got a lot of Jewish supporters, AIPAC supporters, who are completely against Netanyahu, or deeply troubled by everything that's going on. And by the way, when they count AIPAC contributions, they're talking about anyone who has ever given $200 to AIPAC. That then becomes an AIPAC contribution. Well, I've got some longtime supporters who I've worked with on a dozen different issues, who are pro-Israel. Like I said, a lot of Jewish supporters in my area. So I should not take money from these people who have been supporting me for 25 years, worse than because they've also given money to AIPAC at some point. I mean, look, I'm with you. If AIPAC is pushing something that's wrong, and also I'm with you that AIPAC has become a much more partisan organization just in the last 7 or 8 years. And I stopped going to the AIPAC conference in Washington, D.C. 4 or 5 years ago because the last couple of times I went, it was so obviously a partisan exercise. It used to be more of a debate. I mean, one of the things I liked about AIPAC is they take their position, but then they're willing to argue about it. And I've been arguing with them for a long time, and it was a robust, helpful discussion. They took a turn during the first Trump administration and made them vastly more partisan. And I think that's a reason to be highly critical of AIPAC. But to dismiss a Democratic candidate because they got money from someone who has supported AIPAC, if the Democratic Party is going to exclude all of those people, that's not going to be helpful for our coalition building exercise either.
Yeah, no, I don't think we should exclude people from the party who accept donations. I feel like there's been the conversation about AIPAC has been really stilted because you often get accused of anti-Semitism or, figure out whatever pejorative thing people lob at each other on the internet. So I'm glad we're just able to have a rational conversation about it. Bigger picture, I'm glad. Look, I'm grateful to you for having this conversation with me and letting me be kind of annoying about it, because I worry that the conversation about U.S. support for Israel here in America doesn't really reflect the reality for how extreme this government is. You're right. Like, it drove me insane when Joe Biden would be like, I was talking to Golda Meir in 1973, and she said this shit to me. And I'm like, buddy, that Israel is gone. And the current government is made up of violent, radical extremists and people who support extremist policies in the settlement project. And like, you hear a lot of people kind of say, well, when Netanyahu is gone, then we'll have the chance to fix it. Like, I don't know where it doesn't seem like he's going anywhere. And I'm not sure what comes after Netanyahu is a lot better.
Yeah, we won't have a chance to fix it if we don't speak out against it. That's for damn sure. And yes, but that is part of the pain and the difficulty for a lot of people. I mean, Israel is, I think, an important country, and that's something else that we get into with our so-called base. I don't accept the base comment with folks on the left side of our coalition. A base, to me, is something that's with you no matter what. And that very much does not describe the left side of our political coalition, whatever you may think of their positions on issues, is I think what Joe Biden was hearkening back, and you and I have talked about the Joe Biden problem, no need to get into that at the moment, but, is there was a time when Israel was reflective of, where Jews had a place to go after the Holocaust to feel like they could defend themselves, when the Holocaust had proven to them that there was no place that was safe if they didn't have their own place. And that idea of Israel is still there and still part of where a lot of Democrats are at. Now, that contrasts with a significant element of the anti-Israel group, and you are no doubt familiar with the settler colonialism argument, that somehow Israel is an illegal settler colonialist state that never should have been created in the first place. And there's all kinds of problems with that worldview that tends to infect the left side of our political coalition. It has impacts on the U.S., by the way. They don't think that the United States of America is a legitimate state because it's an illegal settler colonialist state as well, which gets into the broader problem of what is the narrative that the Democratic coalition is presenting to the American people. What is our vision of what America has been and is and should be that can counter what Trump is doing? And if that vision is They were an awful, evil, terrible, horrible, white Western capitalist society that shouldn't have existed in the first place. I have problems with that. So once you get into that, and then Israel is stuck into that camp as well. But yes, that was from a long time ago. We have to take Israel as it is, see what Netanyahu is doing to it. And I've had many AIPAC people say to me, oh, well, we don't abandon America because Trump's president. We shouldn't abandon Israel because Netanyahu's president. Well, Netanyahu's been there for 15 years now, and he's doing very troubling things.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying abandon Israel, but absolutely be critical of the Israeli government. And that's something I really disagree with AIPAC on, is they will always say, well, it's not our job to be critical of Israel's government. You're the foremost advocate for them. You can't say you're neutral because you're clearly not. So you ought to be able to criticize Israel and still be a supporter of the right of Israel to exist. And I've never agreed with them on that.
Yeah, I mean, I this sort of the notion that the United States and Israel can't disagree in public and they have to take those disagreements private, like that's such a stupid conventional wisdom that you would hear from folks in the last administration. Right. And it's like, who does that benefit? Bibi Netanyahu, obviously. And like, I personally, like, I don't really have affinities for countries, right? They're made up of leaders and people and policies, and I criticize those or don't. The one thing I want to push back to you on is the idea that criticism for Israel is kind of like a fringe leftist based thing. I mean, there was recently I
didn't say that. I don't agree with that.
Well,
I was talking about a particular component part of that criticism.
Got it. Because
if I gave that impression, thank you for correcting it. I don't agree with that.
Just only because there was a Quinnipiac poll that found 60% of voters disapprove of the U.S. sending military aid to Israel, 32% support it. That includes 75% of Democrats. So I do think like cutting off weapons shipments, as you've talked about in your statement, is like a overwhelmingly supported position at this point.
Absolutely, on the progressive side. But the question, if you had asked in the poll, do you think Israel has a right to exist as a country? I think that was the part that I was getting at, and whether or not there's the component part that we have to deal with, like the guys who showed up and vandalized my house, and a whole lot of other places, the University of Washington, a bunch of other things as well. That's a component part. But no, totally with you. No, it is absolutely a majority opinion within the broad Democratic coalition that blind support for Israel should not be our position.
That's good. That is, and something that has come a long way in recent months. Well, listen, I think we solved it. We locked this thing
Every time I talk to you, we solve the world's problems.
Last time our conversation was about the Democratic Party being a disaster. So we
got work to do.
We're doing our best. Well, listen, I genuinely think that part of that work is conversations like this, which are could be uncomfortable and difficult, but I appreciate you having them.
Yeah, no, thank you. It was really very thoughtful, and I appreciate that. And we got to keep talking and keep working because it's really important, as you have said many, many times.
Amen. All right. Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you.